After a really rough patch where my car decided to give up the ghost and my part-time gig at the bookstore dried up, I was desperate for any work that paid, and that's how I ended up as the night auditor at the Starlight Motel, a lonely speck of a place off a mostly forgotten highway, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't glamorous, mostly just checking in the rare late trucker or weary traveler, running the day's reports, and trying to stay awake with bad coffee and an even worse selection of ancient magazines in the tiny office behind the front desk. The owner, Mr. Henderson, was an old, gruff guy who only cared that the books balanced and no one burned the place down. He told me it was quiet, that I'd mostly have the place to myself, which sounded okay at the time. A bit of peace to maybe study or just think. The first few weeks were exactly that. Dead quiet, a couple of check-ins a night, if that. Then Mr. Silas started staying. He wasn't a regular in the trucker sense. He'd check in for 2 or 3 nights, always requesting room 107 if it was available, pay in cash, then disappear for a week, only to return. He was a tall, thin man, probably in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed in slightly old-fashioned suits, even at 3 in the morning. His demeanor was overly formal, his voice soft and precise, and he had this way of holding eye contact just a little too long that made me feel like a bug under a pin. He'd ask polite but oddly personal questions while I was processing his check-in. Things about my shift, if I found it lonely, what my plans were for the future. I'd give vague answers, trying to keep it professional, but he had a knack for making me feel cornered, even in the small, cluttered office. It started subtly, the weirdness. After his 2nd or 3rd stay, I found a perfectly pressed but very dead flower on the counter when I came in for my shift, right where he'd been standing. No note. The next time, it was a small, intricately folded piece of origami paper, blank. I threw them away, telling myself it was just an eccentric old guy. But a part of me felt observed. He seemed to know when I was busiest with the audit, or when I'd stepped into the back for a moment, because that's when these little offerings would appear. Then I started noticing things about room 107. Even when Mr. Silas was checked out, I'd sometimes hear faint sounds from that end of the L-shaped motel wing. A soft scraping, like furniture being moved very carefully, or what sounded like muffled talking, too indistinct to make out words. I'd do a walk around, check the locks. Everything would seem secure. Mr. Henderson had told me 107 had some quirky plumbing, so I tried to attribute the noises to that. I attempted to politely refuse one of the gifts once, a small, smooth riverstone he'd left. When he returned a week later, I tried to hand it back, saying, "Oh, Mr. Silas, I think you forgot this." He just stared at it in my palm with a look of profound disappointment, almost sadness, and said, "A trifle, my dear, for your solitude." Then he turned and walked to his room without another word, leaving me feeling like I'd committed some major social faux pas. The unease was a slow burn, building with each of his visits. One night, after he'd supposedly checked out earlier that day, I found the door to room 107 slightly ajar. My heart hammered. Protocol was to report it, not enter, but something compelled me. I pushed it open, calling out, "Housekeeping?" The room was dark, the curtains drawn. I flicked on the light. It was impeccably neat, almost sterile. The bed made with military precision. It didn't look like anyone had stayed there. But the air was cold, colder than the rest of the motel, and there was a faint, musty, almost metallic scent. I don't know why, but I opened the drawer of the bedside table. Inside, on top of the Gideon Bible, was a cheap notepad. Several pages had been torn out, but on the remaining top sheet was a crudely drawn, but recognizable sketch of the motel's front office layout, with a small circle drawn around the front desk chair where I sat every night. Underneath it, in neat block letters, was my first name. I slammed the drawer shut, my breath catching in my throat, and got out of there, making sure the door was locked. I wanted to tell Mr. Henderson, But what would I say? That a guest drew a map? He'd think I was crazy. Mr. Silas wasn't due back for days, according to his usual pattern. But he returned that very night, around 4 a.m., just as I was trying to calm my racing pulse. He appeared at the desk as if from nowhere, silent as a shadow. "A problem, my dear?" he asked, his eyes glittering in the dim office light, a small, knowing smile on his lips. He hadn't asked for room 107 this time, just stood there. I stammered something about a late checkout. He nodded slowly. "Some rooms," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "hold more interest than others. One must be careful what doors one opens." Then he simply turned and walked out into the pre-dawn gloom. He didn't check in. I was terrified. He knew. He somehow knew I'd been in that room. The next night, the power in the office flickered, died, then came back on a few seconds later. When it did, there was a new note on the counter, weighted down by a dead bird, a small sparrow. The note just said, "Curiosity." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read it. I looked wildly around the parking lot, but saw no one. Later, as I was forcing myself to do a security walk, I saw him, Mr. Silas, standing at the far end of the unlit corridor of the 100 wing near room 107, just a silhouette against the faint light pollution, watching me, unmoving. That was it. I couldn't take another second. I grabbed my bag, locked the office as best I could, and called my friend from my cell in the parking lot, practically screaming for her to come get me. I told Mr. Henderson I was sick, that I quit. I never went back to the Starlight Motel, and I took a longer, less direct route to my new job for months, terrified I'd see Mr. Silas's car. Sometimes, when I'm working late at my new, much more normal job, and the lights flicker, or I see an older man in a suit, I still feel that chill, that feeling of being watched, of having stumbled too close to someone's dark, unsettling secrets in a place I should have never been. To make ends meet while I was trying to get through community college, I took a job as a night security guard. The company mostly did gigs for places that were either closing down or, like this one, under construction. This particular assignment was a new multi-story office building, basically just a concrete shell at that point, dark and echoing, right on the edge of an industrial park that was dead after 6 p.m. My duties were simple: patrol each floor once an hour, check the perimeter fence, log any incidents, and mostly just be a warm body to deter vandals. The first couple of weeks were mind-numbingly boring. Just me, my flashlight, and the wind whistling through the empty window frames. I'd listen to podcasts, try to read, anything to pass the hours until the day crew arrived. Then I started noticing little things. A stack of tools on the third floor would be slightly rearranged from how I remembered it. A roll of plastic sheeting on the fifth floor would be unfurled a bit. A door to a utility closet I knew I'd secured would be found ajar. I figured it was just the day guys being sloppy, forgetting to tidy up properly. I mentioned it in my logs, but nothing came of it. One night, about a month in, while I was doing my 2 a.m. patrol on the ground floor, I saw another flashlight beam sweeping across the far end of the vast, open space. My heart leaped into my throat. I was supposed to be the only one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the huge area. A figure emerged from behind a stack of drywall. He was a tall guy, wearing a dark blue uniform that wasn't quite like mine, and he had a friendly, almost too eager smile. "Hey there," he said, his voice surprisingly loud. "Marcus, just doing some spot checks for Allied Security. Didn't mean to startle ya." Allied? My company was Titan Security. I'd never heard of Allied doing checks on our sites. His uniform had no company logo, just a generic security patch. "Didn't know anyone else was scheduled," I said, trying to sound casual. But my internal alarm bells were ringing. "Yeah, management likes to keep you guys on your toes," he said with a wink. Mind if I walk with you for a bit? Gets lonely out here." I didn't like it, but what could I say? So Marcus started occasionally joining me on my patrols, always appearing out of nowhere. He asked a lot of questions, too many questions about my route, the dead spots in radio coverage, where the emergency shutoffs were, how long it took for a supervisor to respond to a call. I gave him vague answers, but he was persistent. Soon, the small things being out of place escalated. My personal thermos, which I always left on the folding table in my makeshift office, a corner near the main generator, went missing. I found it a few hours later on the top floor, balanced precariously on a window ledge. Then one night, I started finding these weird symbols, chalked in out-of-the-way places, behind stacks of materials, inside unfinished elevator shafts. They weren't gang tags. They were more like crude, almost tribal-looking designs, and they always seemed to appear after Marcus had been around. I called my supervisor, a guy named Dave, and asked him about Allied security or anyone named Marcus being authorized on site. Dave sounded annoyed. "What are you talking about? No one else is supposed to be there. If you see anyone, you call the cops, then me. Got it?" Now, I was genuinely scared. Marcus wasn't just some overly friendly guard from another company. He was something else. I tried to vary my patrol times, take different routes, but he still found me. One night, I deliberately went to a floor I hadn't told him I frequented and found fresh chalk symbols there, along with a half-eaten sandwich that looked suspiciously like the one I'd packed for my lunch but hadn't gotten to yet. The feeling of being constantly watched, of my space being invaded, was overwhelming. I started feeling like I was the one being patrolled, not the other way around. I knew I had to confront him, or at least try to get a better look at him, maybe even a photo for the police if it came to that. The next time he appeared, I tried to be more direct. "Marcus, what exactly is your role here? My supervisor doesn't know anything about Allied security." He just smiled that wide, unsettling smile. "Supervisors don't know everything, do they? Some of us work a little more discreetly, just making sure things are secure for the right people." His eyes were cold, despite the smile. I decided to try and follow him one night. He said he was going to check the west perimeter, so I gave him a few minutes and then quietly trailed after him. He moved through the dark, unfinished building with an eerie silence and speed that a man his size shouldn't have possessed. I lost him near the loading docks. As I was cautiously looking around, my flashlight beam fell on a small, alcove-like space hidden behind some stacked pallets. Inside, the walls were covered in those same chalk symbols, dozens of them, and in the middle, a crude, almost childlike drawing of a stick figure wearing a security guard uniform, with an X drawn through its head. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just weird, it felt actively malevolent. I backed out of there, my heart pounding. Later that shift, as I was on the 4th floor, the temporary lighting in my entire section suddenly went out, plunging me into pitch darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, and as the beam cut through the black, Marcus was standing there, not 10 feet away, his face unreadable. "Careful now," he said, his voice soft. "Wouldn't want you to trip and fall in the dark. Some people don't like it when you poke your nose where it doesn't belong." He then just turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he were made of them. The lights flickered back on a moment later. That was my breaking point. This wasn't just trespassing or petty vandalism anymore. It felt like a direct threat. I got on my radio and called Dave, my voice shaking, telling him someone was on site, had threatened me, and had sabotaged the lights. I told him I was heading to the main entrance and waiting, and if backup wasn't there in 10 minutes, I was calling the police directly and leaving. Dave actually sounded concerned this time. He and another supervisor were there in 15 minutes, along with a police car. We swept the building. There was no sign of Marcus. The chalk marks were still there, the drawing in the alcove. but he himself had vanished. I wrote up my report, showed them everything. I don't know if they believed the full extent of it, but they saw enough to know something was seriously wrong. I refused to go back to that site. They transferred me to a brightly lit, very public warehouse for the remainder of my time with tightened security. I still have no idea who or what Marcus was. A squatter, a saboteur, part of some weird cult. But every time I see an unfinished building at night, or find myself in a place that's too quiet, I get that same prickling sensation on my skin, that feeling that someone is watching from just beyond the reach of the light, someone who knows more about me than I do about them. I needed cash, fast, after my roommate skipped town leaving me with all the rent, so I took the first job I could find, night attendant at Spin City, a 24-hour laundromat on the dingy edge of downtown. It wasn't a glamorous job, mostly just making change, cleaning lint traps, wiping down machines, and trying to look busy when the owner, Sal, did his occasional late-night drive-by check-ins. The place had seen better decades. Half the fluorescent lights hummed and flickered. A few machines were perpetually out of order, and it always smelled faintly of damp concrete and forgotten socks. Most of the late-night clientele were shift workers, students, or just people who preferred doing their laundry when the world was asleep. And then there was Eliza. She started coming in about a week after I began. She was a thin, pale woman, maybe in her late 40s, though it was hard to tell. She always wore the same faded blue overcoat, regardless of the weather, and a knitted hat pulled down low over her brow. She never made eye contact, just shuffled in, always used the same 2 washing machines in the back corner, numbers 14 and 15, paid with exact change, and then sat on the cracked plastic bench, staring blankly ahead, while her clothes washed and dried. She never spoke a word. At first I just thought she was shy, or maybe a bit eccentric, harmless. But then the little things started. I'd find small, neatly folded items of clothing left near my small attendant's counter after she'd gone. A single child's sock, a man's handkerchief, a delicate lace collar that looked like it belonged to an antique doll. None of it looked like anything Eliza herself would wear. And they weren't items from the lost and found, I checked, when I'd try to give them to her on her next visit, saying, "Excuse me, I think you might have left this." She'd just look at the item with a completely blank expression, sometimes giving a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, before turning back to her machines. The feeling of unease started to grow. Sometimes, after Eliza had loaded her machines and was sitting on her bench, I'd hear what sounded like soft humming, almost a lullaby, coming from the direction of her washers, even though she herself was silent. It was so faint I'd wonder if I was imagining it, or if it was just the thrum of the old machines playing tricks on my ears in the dead of night. The lights above machines 14 and 15 also started acting strangely whenever she was there, flickering more intensely than the others, sometimes dimming almost completely for a second or two. Then, other people's unclaimed laundry, items left in machines or in baskets, started disappearing. Not whole loads, just single, specific items. A bright red scarf, a man's work shirt, a child's brightly patterned pajama top. A day or two later, the missing item would reappear, not in the lost and found, but neatly folded on top of one of the dryers. Sometimes with one of those strange, out-of-place items Eliza left for me tucked inside it. I started watching Eliza more closely, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. One night, after she'd left, a wave of curiosity, mixed with a definite sense of dread, got the better of me. I went over to machines 14 and 15. They were cold, empty, but as I leaned closer to number 14, I felt a distinct cold spot right in front of it, like an open freezer door, even though the laundromat itself was stuffy. And there was a smell, very faint, sweetish but also musty, like old perfume and damp earth. I opened the door to washer 15, which had an out-of-order sign Sal had taped on weeks ago, a machine Eliza often just stood near for a few moments before using her usual two. Tucked deep inside the drum, almost hidden, was a small, grimy, one-eyed teddy bear. It looked ancient. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just eccentricity anymore. I didn't know what it was, but it felt wrong, deeply wrong. The next night Eliza came in. She didn't go to her usual bench. After loading her machines, she walked slowly, deliberately, over to my counter. She stopped right in front of me and just stared. Her eyes, usually downcast, were wide and fixed on mine, and they looked incredibly old and sad. Then she leaned in, her breath smelling faintly of that same sweet, musty odor, and whispered, so low I could barely hear it, "They're waiting. They get so cold." Before I could react, she placed a folded piece of paper on the counter, turned, and shuffled out. I stared at the paper, my hand trembling as I reached for it. It was a child's drawing, crayon on cheap paper. It depicted a crude house and a stick-figure family, a man, a woman, and two smaller figures. One of the smaller figures was violently scribbled over in black crayon, next to. The remaining family, another stick figure had been added, a crude approximation of me, right down to the blue smock Sal made me wear. Underneath it, the word "soon" was written in shaky letters. I felt sick. I ran to the front door, peering out into the dark, empty street. Eliza was gone. I turned back, and that's when I noticed the main glass door, the only way in or out, was now locked. Not from the inside latch, but as if someone had locked it with a key from the outside. I rattled it, panic rising. I was trapped. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, I heard a click, and the door was suddenly unlocked again. I didn't wait to see who or what had done it. I grabbed my phone, my bag, and ran out of there, not even bothering to lock up. I called Sal from a block away, told him I was quitting, that I was sick. He grumbled but didn't ask too many questions. I never found out what Eliza's story was, or what was going on in that laundromat. Was she a ghost? Just a deeply disturbed woman caught in some terrible grief? And what about those clothes, the toy, the drawing? I try not to think about it. But sometimes, when I'm doing my own laundry now, in a bright, busy place in the middle of the day, I still feel a chill, and I can almost hear that soft, humming lullaby, and Eliza's whispered words, "They're waiting." I always check the machines very carefully before I use them now.